He arrived, got out of his car, for whatever reason, he decided to get away. He got past the first terrorist and was running down the field to get away, run behind the house, when he was shot by another terrorist who was obviously on guard down there. The following morning, search was mounted, and his body was found lying near a drain in a field, quite a short distance away from the house. He didn't die immediately. He crawled some distance and obviously wasn't able to crawl to safety. And clearly he died a lonely and painful and cruel death.
That in itself sent shockwaves through the country, and particularly through government, that this organisation could callously kill a member of the Oireachtas. The priority had to be countering paramilitary crime. They were the biggest threat.
That's the first political murder since 1927, when Kevin O'Higgins was assassinated. So the murder of a member of the Oireachtas can't be more serious. What you'd have to say is that at certain points we teetered very close to anarchy.
It's inconceivable that the people who murdered him didn't know who he was. They were neighbours, they were residents of this locality, quite close to his local place. So I'm quite satisfied that they knew who he was and killed him, notwithstanding his position, his status as a member of the nation's parliament.
The killing of Billy Fox, just like the gunning down of Garda Fallon, is forgotten now. The senator's assassination was then just one of many murders the government had to deal with. In the shadow of the gunmen, the criminals were busy robbing banks, stealing jewellery and breaking into factories for merchandise to sell on. Christy Dunn had long abandoned revolution and was back doing what he did best, robbing for personal gain. In 1975, Christy Dunn showed he had learned a trick or two from the IRA when he added tiger kidnapping to his repertoire. In February of that year, he led a gang that kept captive the family of the manager of West's Jewellers on Grafton Street at their Booterstown home. Later, Dunn forced the manager, Robert Halpin, to open the safe in West's and made off with £70,000 worth of precious stones. This was just one of the 153 armed robberies carried out in 1975.
There's no coincidence that armed robberies escalated in the Republic. And this, I suppose, was not divorced from what was happening in Northern Ireland with the various paramilitaries and the awful, awful violence that was happening there.
In any caper that involved big money and lots of manpower, there was a good chance the Dunns weren't far away.
Well, they were a very active criminal family, and they were into big robberies, like jewellery robberies. They certainly were into serious crime and greed and money, and that drives all serious crime. It's all about money.
By 1977, one of the brightest students from the Dunn Crime Academy was beginning to make waves in his own right. Martin Cahill hit the headlines with a raid on the Semper tire factory in Ballyfermot in Dublin. The heist would bear the hallmarks of all the general's strokes: precision, planning and violence. In order to hit the security van the moment it arrived with the payroll for 1,000 workers, Cahill first abducted the O'Neill family.
The fella was upstairs and told if any of us went to the window that we'd be shot. We were just to keep quiet. So we stayed there.
The general held the O'Neills at gunpoint overnight. Next morning, his gang cut through the factory perimeter fence at the bottom of their garden, just as the wages van arrived.
The five of them that I seen had guns. One of them stayed with me and the missus, and he was giving instructions from the back room window over. He had a walkie-talkie. When the van pulled up, I heard your man roll, get him now. So there was 2 shots rang out.
Cahill's 5-man gang opened fire with their weapons and shot a security guard. They escaped on motorcycles with £53,000 in cash. Organised crime was now becoming a force to be reckoned with.
Crime of its nature, in order to succeed, has to become organised. It has to organise itself as a business. And I think the Gardaí didn't react rapidly enough to this new phenomenon of criminals organising themselves.
Now you create an alternative lifestyle. And of course there's a high degree of attraction for somebody who comes from a background of low income, suddenly seeing the potential to gain a very high standard of living.
In 1978, the Duns carried out a heist in Roscrea, County Tipperary. This was to be a decisive turning point in the story of organised crime in Ireland.
Antigen is something of a modern miracle. It's in the middle of Ireland, far from air and seaports, about the last place in the world in which you think of setting up a pharmaceuticals industry.
In July 1978, Christy, Shamey and Henry Dunn raided this factory and made off with £300,000 worth of the painkiller Palfium. Christy and Shamey were unaware of the potential value of the haul, but their brother Henry was. Henry paid his brothers £3,000 for their share and sold the painkiller for a massive markup on the black market. The pennies suddenly dropped for Shamey, Mickey, Boyo and Larry. Drugs was the way to go. This was to be a seminal moment in the history of organised crime in Ireland.
Obviously they made money and they had a look around and said, well, there's drugs, there's a market for drugs here in this country, and let's get into this. There's money, we'll invest so much money, we'll bring in drugs, we'll quadruple our profit, and that drove it.
And you don't have to tell me about the appalling social consequences of the introduction of drugs into this country, what that has been. It's been highly corrosive in terms of solidarity particularly amongst working class communities, which would have been very cohesive, even societies where they'd been taken out of the middle of the city and then planked, I think wrongly, by the corporation out in Ballyfermot and Cabra and Crumlin and Kimmage and Finglas or wherever. They were very cohesive societies in which people quite literally did help each other. But that has been, I think, the greatest casualty of what has happened.
Heroin would be the grim reaper of the 1980s. But the big story of the 1970s was the story of a sustained attack against the state. The first shots were fired by Saor Éire, but the main assault came from the IRA. The offensive forced successive governments to meet fire with fire and take their eye off the looming menace of organised crime.
I don't think that it overstates it to say that, in part at least, the present criminal situation is a legacy of the terrorist violence that arose in the early 70s. I think it gave an example to a lot of others that they could act in a ruthless and vicious fashion and hope to get away with it.
Organised crime as we know it today hadn't then emerged except, and significantly except, in the ranks of the provos, because the cult of organised crime and the cult of the gun began in those times with the provos, spilled over into gangland in the cities, Limerick, Dublin, and to a lesser extent Cork. And I think one can say without fear of contradiction that the appalling crime situation that we have today can be linked quite clearly back to the provos and their campaign of the 70s and 80s.
We would not have had a descent into organised crime to the extent that we have unfortunately suffered from. And to me, it is inescapable that the direct causal link is the IRA and the introduction of the gun and the introduction of the bomb and the application of organisation to criminal activity.
We had a major paramilitary threat to deal with over the years. And if it is suggested that this should not have in any way distracted from the fight against ordinary crime, if one wants to call it that, well, that is a spurious argument. If we had no paramilitary activity, yes, we would have crime. We would have organised crime. But I believe not on the scale that we have today.
It brought down the value of human life in Irish society as we knew it. And sadly, that's happening with the drug gangs now. Very difficult. They operate in a cell situation, the same as the provos operated. They don't tell many outside the cell what's going on because the stakes are very high. They're all fighting the same battle out there for supremacy in the supply of drugs.
Organised crime in Ireland centres around criminal fraternities or criminal networks, far more loosely structured than anything that was the case in the IRA. However, these criminal connections that are required for drug trafficking, for money laundering and so on, seem to have piggybacked on the connections that were already in place because of paramilitary organisations such as the IRA. And certainly the availability of guns and the know-how as to how to access these guns seems to have been passed down from paramilitary organisations to these looser criminal groups.
In all, 17 arrests were made in Spain. Dubliner Christy Kinahan, said to be the boss, was arrested along with his 2 sons.
The fact is that, to our shame, we have created a mafia that's the equal of any mafia anywhere in Europe, and we have created an international criminal problem of a high order, and that is the legacy.
Some are still living with the toll of that bitter legacy. In 1970, when Garda Richard Fallon was murdered by Saor Éire, few could have imagined the scale of the grief that was to come in the years ahead.
My father's death was the breaking of the taboo of murder in Ireland, in that from then on, life became not too high a price to pay in violence and in crime in this country, and I don't think it's ever gone down since. In fact, it's exponentially increased ever since.
The gun was here to stay. But it was narcotics that would propel organised crime into the big time. The Duns would bring it in by the kilo.
The profits that were to be made, they simply could not resist. Some of it, frankly, was quite unbelievable.
Their old associate, John Gilligan, would bring it in by the ton.
The Gilligan gang brought drug trafficking in this country to another level. They brought an almost business-like structure to their empire.
The spoils were so good, a new wave of gangsters would emerge.
Some of them think that they have a degree of respect, but the reality of it is none of these gangs last longer than 3 to 4 years.
With so much to gain, all this would lead to war.
And next week on One, Badfellas looks at how narcotics became the engine of organised crime here from the late 1970s and now comprises the most lucrative criminal activity. That's at 9:35. Coming up next here on One, The Frontline, and Pat has more details in just a few moments.